Hello and welcome back to episode 3 of the Three Body Podcast. Costin Ryu is on vacation. I believe he's in Santorini having a glass of wine somewhere. But we have a guest host today, Dave Aitel, CEO of Cordyceps Systems, formerly of Immunity. Thank you for filling
Thank
in
you for
today.
having me. Looking forward to it.
It is Friday, July 5th at exactly 8:07 a.m. Juan is back in Miami after a trip to Recon. How are you, Juan?
I've got a little bit of conference flu or something, so I'm struggling a bit, but I'll manage.
How was the con? Can you spend a second on this, just a big wrap up of Recon?
Man, I mean, I'm sad that you're asking because I'm going to tell you the truth, and it's not good. Like, I think a lot of us love Recon as like the only reverse engineering focused conference in the space, and the organization around it has fallen into disrepair in a way that's like it's almost like
Visible.
it's a slow death, like to the point where I and a handful of other people had to run HDMI cables through the audience for the keynote to be able to speak because she had been standing on stage for 30 minutes, no slides, no microphone. Like it's not a not a good look. So I think a lot of us love the conference. I hope that somebody will buy it or stand in or make an alternative, but I don't know that in good conscience I would tell people to like spend their money on it right now. Though the content is pretty unique to it.
I know some people who are putting
And
up
Dave,
an alternative, shall we say? So watch that space.
so there are talks about like having some sort of replacement. Dave, just before we started recording, you and I were talking about infiltrate and
There's,
the gap that's been left behind by the more or less the disappearance of infiltrate since the
yeah, I think
acquisition.
it's kind of a
What is
shame.
going on with
You're
that?
you're not wrong. There's a gap, and especially in the sort of domestic United States area. A lot of us are going over to Germany for Offensive Con, which I think has been carrying the torch. But it's, there's a different crowd there, and I think there needs to be an offensive focused conference here in the states as well. I don't know if Miami is still the right place to throw a conference. To be completely honest, I think you might want to move a little further
Mhm.
north, where it's not 1 million degrees and under threat of hurricanes. Even in the middle of winter. So I think this is going to space that's going to continue to evolve. I think there's room for both of those things in the United States, like a reverse engineering conference which has a different crowd,
Right.
slightly different crowd, slightly different focus, and then an offensive conference.
Conference organizing is a full-time job though. Like conference organizing is not easy in a lot of respects. It's kind of a voluntary thing where you throw a lot of time behind it. Juan and I are working on LabsCon. You talk about, not a place not being a million degrees will be a million degrees in September here in Arizona. But I mean, the point around like these conferences kind of, they peak and then they fade away because it's a lot of work, a lot of sustaining work
It
over
is. We
time.
saw like T2 stopped this year. There've been some great
Hmm.
conferences where they sort of just ran their course.
Enigma died.
Enigma,
ShmooCon.
ShmooCon, the conference space is open, and I think I did not get as much value out of some of the bigger Vegas cons as I wanted to last year. Just they're just too oppressively huge and
Mhm.
almost diverse, right? Like there's too much happening. I couldn't focus on anything, right? So uh, I think we're going to see some movement in that space for sure.
I hope so. I mean, even look at what's happening with DEF CON, right? Like this year is going to be weird. Like it's just a weird venue. It very much feels like a convention now.
Yes.
It's not so much a conference as a convention space, and uh, like you said, the sort of the conference space is open. Like I do think somebody has to. Well, there's opportunity for folks who might want to try something
Yeah.
different, even during summer camp, because I don't think folks are quite as into what things have turned into.
No, and honestly, the other truth of it is it's like as you say, logistics is hard. Getting the right people in the room is hard. Um, but I'm looking forward to the next generation. To be honest, of these conferences, I think they're good. I think they're really valuable.
All right, enough about conferences. In fairness, there's sometimes too many conferences as well. Can we? I want to pivot to the news of the week. The biggest story this week is obviously the OpenSSH unauthenticated remote code execution vulnerability found by the guys at Qualys. Usually, when you put those words together, it's the internet is on fire. Stop everything and rush the patch. In this case, there were some circumstances that made it not necessarily a big security risk. Dave, I want to pivot to you first. Surprised to you that we're still seeing RCs in
No, not
OpenSSH?
at all. I mean, maybe if you thought that OpenSSH was secure, you'd be surprised. Just because something's been looked at a lot doesn't mean it's secure, still written in C, still, a really dangerous piece of software to have on your system. Always going to be true. I don't know why it hasn't been rewritten in Rust.
First one in a long time, though.
First one that people know about in a long time, right? Like, so that's the thing about these things is like, like, I mean, there's a lot. All right. So here's one thing that I think is really, you said that there were like some things that made this not that interesting, which is true, right? Like people are like, well, right now we only have an exploit for 32-bit. There's a lot of complicated stuff in here. I think the Qualys team tipped their hand a little bit with their methodologies for how you go about exploiting remote race conditions in a systematic way. I just think the public open source research is not as advanced as private research in that area.
So I'm glad to hear you say that, because the exploit side of things is so far out of my wheelhouse, and I just have kind of a fascination with it. But I have been a little disturbed by how comforted and comfortable we are with this idea that there's a regression. We know there's an exploit. We know there's somebody who's been actively exploiting it, but it's hard to exploit. So it's unreliable. You're going to need to hit this thing 1,000 times before it works. So it's fine. And I'm like, to me, those are the conditions for what was discovered. Sort of the canary in the coal mine. Now you've put every exploit dev out there who actually may be much better at this. You've let them know this thing is out there. It's sitting there. It's likely unpatched in many of these other places. You're telling me that there's no way to more reliably hit this thing. You're telling me that there's not a bunch of OpenSSH running systems that don't have ASLR turned on, or like that there isn't an alternative for non-32-bit systems. Like I'm almost dismayed at the level of comfort that we've given ourselves so quickly and easily about
No, I think
this
what you're describing as comfort is just notes that like widespread opportunistic exploitation is unlikely. I think that's the argument. Is it's not that you shouldn't stop and go look for things to patch, or you shouldn't try to put your mitigations in place.
I totally agree.
It's that this is not going to be one of those wormable widespread things. Is that a fair
Totally
assessment, Dave?
agree with where people are feeling on this. I agree with both of you, actually. Right? So people are comforted in their own hearts that their personal systems are not being targeted. And then people are also
Right.
like systematically looking at it. They're like, oh, it's not a systematic risk to the internet because it's unlikely to be, something that everyone hits. Even though in theory you could plug this into mass scan and hit the whole internet at once. Right? So that's a possibility. And y'all know better than I do how few systems internally get patched. Right? So like the systems internally to a larger corporation are a super melange of old, outdated nonsense, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
so, um, you may see use out of these exploits for a decade to come because of that. I think the one of my main takeaways here was hunters are patient, just in general, right? Like, and I think it's really funny that people are like, well, this exploit takes a week to run, therefore it's not that good. And I'm like, a lot of great exploits take a long time to run because you have to increment a counter and it has to overflow across 32 bits. Like, so that's a realistically, once 64-bit became a thing and 32-bit counters could be overflowed and run to zero, and then you could still have memory allocations. There's a huge space of really good exploits that took weeks to run. Who cares? And that this is one of them, right? So like that's a funny thing that the offensive teams are well aware of that the defensive teams maybe are not. I don't know.
I think that's what I'm trying to get my that's where I'm sort of sitting here and going, look, I'm glad we're all comforted, but should we be? Right? 'Cause let's be honest, nobody's running to patch this if you don't tell them that the internet is on fire and the whole place is melting down, especially right before a holiday and whatnot. But more than anything, the fact that we're sitting here going like, this is okay. It's really fine. It's built upon the premise of one particular way to hit this vulnerability and its constraints. So that's where I look at Dave and other people who know this space a lot better and go, I feel like you guys know how to do this better. Someone out there knows how to do this better than what's already known to us. And there's nothing inherent in the vulnerability that says that someone isn't going to figure out how to hit this better.
And they talk about it a little bit, right? So they're like, an LLM might help us, they say. They're sort of making it up, you know what I'm saying? But they also point out that this is something that other people saw as well. They point to the little Bugzilla thing where they're like, hey, someone else noticed that there's a signal race here. We're not the only ones who can see these things. So you're not wrong. These risks are always downplayed because it does make us feel better, right? It's like we think we can recycle plastic, right? Like there's a whole bunch of things that like make you feel better and you just do them. It's great for you. Otherwise,
Dave, did it help that this is a bug that we knew about in 2006, previously reported by Dowd? Two things. How does a bug get accidentally reintroduced? One. And did it help this comfort level to know that we had seen this before? It was...
I almost thought it made it feel like we were even
You're gonna make it worse?
Yeah, I know. I made it worse
Yeah.
for me. I'm like, oh, so you knew about it. So you redid it? That's great. That's fantastic.
Wow.
No, from a protecting ourselves from it point of view.
I think maybe, I mean, obviously, like things have changed since 2006. I went back to the National Vulnerability Database to look at the, all the links from Dowd's original bug.
There still is a national vulnerability
There is.
database.
One of the best things about it, though, is if you go to this particular bug in 2006, you'll notice that almost all the links are broken. Right? So that's actually really fun. Is like to see the bit rot of the internet has forgotten this bug, but Qualys hasn't.
Interesting.
So
that's a nice bit of advertisement for them. They should take that as a byline.
Yeah, we know where these people
But
come
it also
from,
tells
right?
us,
Like,
it also tells us about the quality of the NVD as well. I mean, as a reliable database of where you should be able to go back and find, the history.
you
of these
should.
things.
This was something we should have thought about 20 years ago. Is that we're going to need a really solid history for all this recorded in like somewhere easily accessible because the data is so valuable, right? Like, what's the actual patch that introduces and removes this vulnerability? Would have been a great thing to be able to get 3 clicks into. But no,
Right.
you can't see that here. So all that information is real fun. I don't think it makes me feel better that it's an old bug. I think there's a set of vulnerability types, like bug classes, that I think people both know about but don't care about. And that's always been where hackers have lived, right? So you try to do the unexpected, and a lot of that is things that people have thought weren't that important. And I'll just tie this right to modern events, right? James Kettle is doing a talk at DEF CON or Black Hat or something about timing attacks as well, right? He's doing race conditions in modern HTTP apps. And people had written off the idea of race conditions in modern apps. And even though he talked about it last year, they're like, oh, well, that was cool, whatever, right? Like, and he's teaching his class. He's like, no, these are real. These are things that can actually happen in your web apps. And people are like, yeah, it's good to know, but like,
That's great,
that's
guy.
great. There's like you find 5 bugs, who cares, right? The reality is these things, if you're a good hacker, you're looking for the cutting edge. You actually are saying, oh, this guy's onto something, and I need to go further than he did. And that's how the system works, right? The offense, if you listen to Mark Dowd's podcast, he said the offensive teams are 2 years ahead of the defensive teams because they have to be.
So that's exactly why I wanted to ask you about this bug the way that we have, because not only am I put off by the notion that we're seeking comfort so quickly at the discovery of this thing, but I am extremely aware that we don't know what the hell is going on in the real cutting edge vulnerability space at all. Like, whatever we talk about as 0 days, whatever we talk about as sort of exploitation in the wild, you're talking about something that's just we're so far behind on the discovery, and B, it means that we got to see like a shooting star and got to, just try to characterize it, but we do not understand what is happening in that space for the most part. So I don't want to, set the coordinates of our comfort around O-Day as being like, well, this is the one we know and this is the only way it can work. Like, that clearly is not the case.
I mean, I wouldn't say it's the case. I would say that you have to look a little bigger on this one and look at like what class of vulnerabilities are we missing. It's not just all about SSH in this particular case. There's going to be old SSH boxes laying around that are still vulnerable. but it's about the technique.
There's a long tail for this bug. You think this bug has a long tail where offensive security, big game offensive security teams are investing in?
And I mean, I don't even know, to be honest. I think you're going to want to hit this bug. It's because it's exposed in a lot of places. But I also think this is the kind of bug that gets people excited to hit just because they're counting coup. You saw exploits coming out, immediately, but getting it to a level of polish. Honestly, you often don't see a level of polish from a bug unless people have had it for a while as Ode, right? Like I think that's always been one of the big tells.
And the POC right now apparently doesn't work. Like it's not like it's just sitting out there. My understanding is that the proof of concept code that everybody's been sort of freaking out about, it doesn't actually work yet.
And it's
right?
not
It's
really
to
the
that
basis to build the real thing on yet either.
Right.
But it's almost like a document. They're like, this is a start, which is fine. I mean, that's what it comes down to.
I want to you guys mentioned OD, and I want to just kind of throw in something here. There was a Cisco NXOS OD used in the wild, discovered in the wild, linked to Chinese APT that happened this week, and nobody talked about it. It was just kind of flew under the radar. And there have been, according to the zero-day database, there have been 43 documented in the wild OD attacks, in the wild discoveries so far in 2024. Like those numbers either appear staggering to someone, or to someone it's a roll of the eye of like, okay, this is just our reality. Dave, why are we here?
Why does Ode exist?
No, not only is
why are we
does
here?
it exist, but why are we here as an industry where everything is on fire over here and nobody cares, and we all get excited about an OpenSSH unauthenticated RCE over here, and it just feels like we're disconnected.
You get excited about it the way you do when you see like a train crash, right? It's not. Let's be clear.
I mean, I think there's two different things here, right? The OpenSSH bug is art, and people get excited about art. And then on the other hand is an industrialization of a surveillance capability that the Chinese government has put together and has aimed directly at our hearts. So, I mean, those are two different feelings for us, almost two different industries that we use to address them. I think the Cisco bug is a command injection bug. I think Cisco NX has not had the world's best. This isn't the first ODE that they've even had from. I mean, we saw this in the iSoon leaks. Like the iSoon team had a Cisco NX bug, if I remember correctly. And they weren't the top tier team in China, from what we can tell from those leaks. So, and I don't do a ton of threat intelligence, but I would just say like this. I think part of the issue is like, yeah, that should be really important if you're running Cisco NX. But if you're running Cisco NX still, why? Why are you doing that? Right? Like, you already knew that you had a problem and you should have thrown them into the sun. So you didn't throw it into the sun, and now I blame you. You know what I'm saying?
Well, come on, man. Like, what do you run that is not... What appliance do you run that is not currently being popped by the Chinese en masse? And I say this like, look, when you tell me there's a 0-day in Cisco anything, in my mind, I'm almost relieved because at least Cisco's still patching their shit, and like they'll acknowledge that something is happening.
They have a good piece.
Where it's like,
to be fair, they do.
Yeah, they do. And for the past 2 years, what we've been dealing with is like Fortinet and Pulse Secure, Ivanti, whatever the hell you want to call them, not acknowledging that it is happening, then sort of acknowledging that it is happening, then asking you to sign an NDA to even help you try to triage whether something is happening on your box. Then they go, yeah, here's a 0-day. Don't worry, we'll throw it in the pile with all the other 0 days that everybody's been exploiting, and you move on. Right, the edge device thing is just insane.
Even that is not the worst part of the political process that they're going through, right? Like, I think the worst thing is when they encrypt their appliance and then tell you it's to protect you from the adversaries. When clearly it's to protect them from a bad PR moment. The adversaries decrypt it very quickly. Right? Like, but you have no access to do forensics. So you don't know if you've been hit or not. Like, I think that is the worst thing they do. And honestly, it's one of those things that I just don't think like CISA can't address because it has a good cover story, if that makes sense.
That's definitely one of those places where you expected, like, if there was a spot for regulation to come in, and just in the sense of like defending customers and users. It's like, yeah, selling me an appliance that I cannot readily investigate, that is vulnerable, and then telling me the only way that I can check it is by signing an NDA so I can't tell other people that this appliance is vulnerable, is a state of, consumer fucked upness that I would have expected the government to maybe attempt to intercede.
I mean, I'm sure they're trying. I know that they've been pushing regulations left, right, and center. I think the latest one is the idea that any software company with more than $47 million in revenue needs to report compromises within 72 hours, if I read correctly. I think that's a proposed rule right now and not a rule.
Can they report that through the NDA that Fortinet made them sign? Or
it's a really good question. I don't know how the logistics really work in these cases. I think it's a Slack channel, right? Like, I'm not on the Slack channel. So
Yeah, but here, Juan raises a great point about like just the muckiness in that edge device world and all of this stuff, right? But these companies have all signed the CSRB, the CISA pledge, right? A pledge that
pledge.
commits the purity pledge that commits them to these 8 goals, and these they're genuine goals that push people in the right direction. But
you can make motivational posters out of them, right? Like they're lovely.
Right, but a company like Ivanti signs it, right? But we know in the background they're a complete and utter mess. Does that give them cover, Dave? Like, do you think CISA is providing these companies with a little bit of cover and a little bit of wiggle room to issue press releases for another year about how serious they are before we could even get to the point of like some of them aren't even looking at MFA yet? Or like,
is it wiggle room, or is it, I think it's different for every company, right? Like Microsoft signed it. But I also saw a lot of security companies signing it, right? Like, so, I mean, you call Avanti.
Well, why wouldn't you?
Why wouldn't you sign
There's
it?
no teeth to it. Like, look, if I go and sign this thing and my code base is 20 years old which is the case for like a company like Avanti, where it's just like, we've bought 6 companies, renamed ourselves 10 times, and then the code base is still more or less the same for 20 years. Like, yes, I'll sign a pledge that says that whatever code we decide to write from this point forward will be in Rust and will be like, blessed by a CISA minister or something. But I have no intention of rewriting my entire code base.
No.
So,
and even if you wanted to, you couldn't. Right. Like the Rust thing has to stop.
The pledge doesn't ask you to do that, though.
It doesn't really ask you to do anything.
No, it doesn't. You make so many good points here, but I just think that the reality of like the pledge is that a lot of it's PR, but PR is not a bad thing, right? Like having like a little, like, yes, it provides sort of a cover in a sense, like, but I don't think it's a malicious cover. I think it's sort of like you can use these pledges internally, and I think that's a lot of what you see CISA do. Is you can see them say like, okay, now that you've signed the pledge, you can beat up your VPs using the pledge, right? So like, I think some of this stuff is pretty genius in its way. It just appears nonsensical from the outside because the dynamics don't make any sense, right? Like you signed a toothless pledge, you're not going to change anything. And the answer is, yeah, of course they're not. We have no teeth anywhere in government that could properly address this problem. We need them to address it themselves. So we're going to give one guy or person who's inside one of these companies a little stick that you can use to poke something with, and that's it.
How about can we give her some whistleblower protections along the way as well for when they inevitably get fired for not shutting the fuck up about
Fair enough, Dave, but let me push back a little bit because we said the same thing about the creation of the CSRB. The make up the CSRB, it has no enforcement power. It's just a lot of talking. CSRB actually brought Microsoft to their knees, and we actually saw contrite Microsoft implementing changes, or at least maybe we can call it PR again. But isn't it fair to say the CSRB actually had a significant effect on where things are going?
It had an effect on the conversation, for sure, right? Like, so a PR blow is still a PR blow. Microsoft spends a lot of time, and all the big companies do, trying to make sure their image is unsullied. So it's not nothing. I would say that the CSRB, I think, has underperformed from what most people were hoping for.
Wow.
I would say so. Look, I like all the people on it. I'm not saying that. I just feel like...
Well, you like that class of the CSRB, right? Like, let's also acknowledge the fact that like we had some really amazing people, Dmitry Alperovich, Katie Masuris, on the CSRB, among others. But they're also like rotating, right? Like so we liked a certain class of the CSRB, and to Ryan's point, I was deeply impressed with them. Like, I did not think that the Microsoft report was going to actually come out and say things the way they were, and they did, and it's super impressive.
Okay, the Microsoft
Then we get to
report
the
might have
fact
been
that,
a
like,
high watermark, though.
yeah, no, for sure. I mean, you can see even the politicization of it, even as Brad Smith discussed the CSRB with Congress and others. It was like, well, maybe next time you can maybe not staff it with people that have an axe to grind with Microsoft. You're like, yeah, you're
He
clearly
has a
not
point,
understanding.
though.
No, he does not.
Liz,
Absolutely not.
He absolutely has a point. Like, the VP at Google doesn't belong there. It doesn't matter how great they are.
But I'm sorry. Look. I'll say this: Heather recused herself before the cloud thing, and
They
where
have
the
rules
hell?
in place that demand those recusals.
But
These are
where
not
do you
voluntary
find
recusals,
people that know what's going
We have a
on
deep
and
bench.
understand
Come
what's
on,
happening?
in the whole
Who don't
United
work
States,
at
we
a
can't find
competitor?
someone
Who
in
doesn't
the
work
whole
at a
United States.
competitor of Microsoft?
I'm
Microsoft
not
is in
buying that.
everything.
Okay, but
Google is in
I
everything.
I think we have a deep
And it's not
bench.
only about the private sector participants; it's about the government participants as well. Like, there are the makeup of the board isn't
Agreed.
perfect. I give him that.
It can't be. Which one?
I disagree
Where are you
with
going to
that.
get a bunch of government participants who are not about to leave the government and go get a job at Microsoft next week?
I mean, that's a tool Microsoft uses very well.
Absolutely,
Right? Like, and I think that
it is a
tool
tool that Microsoft
used
uses.
heavily against like the academic world and like sort of the think tank world, even more so, right? It's hard to get a think tanker to put out a report critical of Microsoft because where's the next job coming from?
Look, the reality of the Microsoft situation is worse than we know, and like I think in the pre-recording chat, like we were talking about how like U.S. centric we can be here. Well, like I was in The Hague, the beginning. Wow, Jesus Christ, the beginning of last week, and we were talking about issues with Microsoft, issues with GDPR, etc. But like what I was trying to drive point to them is, the point I was trying to drive home to them was there is an obsession with regulatory capture from the part of Microsoft in Europe. And it's actually it should be insulting to us in the US because it doesn't happen in the US because I don't think they think that any regulatory problems could possibly come out of our gridlocked, shitty system in the US. So there's this obsession with the EU going after, events at the ICC, having the Cyber Peace Institute lobbying everybody out there. There's just constant Microsoft outpouring. Brad Smith out there talking to everybody. In the US, they don't even bother. And they'll just come and like lie to Congress and walk away, and everybody sort of like dusts off their
They
hands
don't
and
have
move
to.
on. Yeah, which is something that to us as Americans should maybe concern us, that like the big companies have gotten to the point where they do not feel threatened by the U.S. government in any way whatsoever.
Would you? I mean, I get it. Like,
no, I don't. But I wish they were. Like, I wish they did. Right. The whole point is there's supposed to be this countervailing forces that are trying to keep each other honest here, and that tension does not exist on this side of the world.
I mean,
Well, let me point out here, that we are less than 24 hours after the election of a new prime minister in England, where there's a lot of cybersecurity regulation-based conversations or security things happening from the previous government. Dave, do you think there's some disruption in place? That there's some disruption coming down the pipe in this conversation that Juan
I'll just say
described?
I'm looking carefully at the Pall Mall process, as they call it, which is a process.
What is the Pall Mall process?
So it's a diplomatic process that the British and French are leading, and both of them have had pretty big hands in it. But it's about looking at intrusion software and who's buying it and what you can do to essentially normalize the practice such that it's not being causing systemic risk, is the theory. So it's a pretty big process, right? So it's a diplomatic process with cabinet members from the UK are involved. And I'm not an expert at the UK's government, but I kind of assume those cabinet members got fired yesterday. Like maybe, or maybe not. I don't actually know, right? It's like, so it's sort of like these processes can get disrupted. And the same thing happens here in the States, right? So, every national cyber strategy quotes its last national cyber strategy, but they come from really different, theories of government. So if we get another Trump administration, we're going to have a very different theory of how regulation should happen in this space. And when you interrupt these processes, I think they're very delicate, right? Like if you stop having the conversation on software liabilities for 4 years, does that kill it, or does it just reappear in 4 years as if nothing had changed? Do we have two governments or one?
Right. A lot of this stuff is driven by momentum,
I would
right?
think so.
Like real momentum.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, I don't understand enough about the policy at all. I don't understand policy at all. But like, if there's one aspect of the Trump administration that folks seemed almost excited about and saw progress in, it was the cyber side, the pointy end of the spear within the USG, and getting a bit more of like allowances and less red tape, somehow bureaucracy getting removed from the process of actually using some of the cyber capabilities in the US government, and God knows what else sort of falling out from that. And I'm very curious. Like I will openly say I am not enthused by the idea of another Trump administration. I don't know who may or may not be. I do think there's two issues where that may very well prove beneficial to some niche of folks, and it's like folks concerned about like Israel's ability to do whatever it needs to do under the circumstances, and people hoping for more offensive cyber operations. Like those two, in my book, those are two camps that like can actually be excited for a new Trump administration, whatever that means.
Or a Kamala administration, to be honest. Like Kamala came out on Twitter, and everyone's been being really annoyed at her for not wanting to use Bluetooth headphones. And she's like, it's a security risk. And I think it's been a long time since we've had a president who understood that Bluetooth can be a security risk. That's pretty cool.
Well, you can barely get Bluetooth to work when you want.
Maybe
it to
that's the
work.
real
I don't know
issue.
how you get it to
Come
work for an
on.
exploit. I can't have you guys using Bluetooth microphones for this podcast, for
That's
example.
true as well.
Fucking boomer.
Let me pivot to something that kind of just happened, and I have not seen much of a cybersecurity conversation around. Is the Supreme Court ruling on the Chevron deference has been overturned? Do you expect security regulations implications from that, Dave?
I do. I mean, I saw Juan shake his head, but the reality is like
Only in disapproval. I have no idea.
okay. I see a lot of. There's not going to be a lot of specificity in general to cyber regulations in the law. First of all, it's moving too fast. It's tough to write laws about today's technology, and then you find out 3 weeks later they're completely wrong, and or just unworkable, right? Like so, right now, if you look at like the national cyber strategy, you could see them say, "Well, we want Rust on everything," and then you're like, "Yeah, but we don't have any Rust programmers, so that's not going to happen." But if you'd written that into law, like, "Oh, you can't, launch a new operating system in space without Rust," you would now have an unworkable law, right? So the specifics are not going in there, and I think the same thing is true for regulation in general in this space. It's just really tough. The sectors are evolving. I think the Cyberspace Solarium's done a pretty good job of getting their idea of what should be going into regulation and just into cyber in general. But a lot of that, they've done the really easy stuff first. So they've done a lot of the sort of, I'm going to add more money to a pot and give a little task to CISA, right? Like that's kind of the bread and butter of some of the latest regulation sort of, or cyber legal shenanigans. But in general, like FCC is hit pretty hard, right? The Federal Communications Law is one of the most vague you could possibly come and outdated, right? Like, and they've been running on just the Chevron ruling for the last many years. And I think the same thing we're going to see in cyber is people are just sort of going to.
Do you expect litigation? Do you
Constant
expect
litigation
to like existing decisions? No. To old existing decisions?
Of course, they're going to start regulating all the FCC things that they don't like, and then they're going to start. I mean, anyone who's, for example, if you're a larger than $47 million revenue software company, and CISA says, "Here's a new regulation for you," you're gonna. It's cheaper to litigate it than to follow it. That's an endless series of excitement for our cyber strategy.
Strategy.
How does it?
Quotes.
You mentioned the strategy calls for regulations for securing critical infrastructure. I mean, if you look at page 8 of the strategy, that's there. Chevron being overturned affects that directly.
Of course
right?
it does. But I mean, they say critical infrastructure. Those are really broad swaths of industry. I think schooling is considered a critical infrastructure under that definition. And we all know Miami-Dade is humongous. I think they have 4 people securing 300,000 computers, probably. I don't know. If you had to guess. So everything is critical infrastructure. Everything's going to be, in theory, regulated, and then everything's going to end up in the courts. That would be my summary.
Right. But the reason
Or
we
you
had
can
Chevron
skip the whole problem and not regulate any of it, which is where we seem to be.
And that's where we've been for the last 20 years, and I think people find it also untenable, right? So we are between a rock and a very hard place.
Yeah, I'll admit I'm kind of sad because we started to see the involvement of the FCC in some of these things, and it was like an adult walked in the room for 30 seconds. We were like, okay, they're used to doing some no nonsense regulation. They're used to some of the criticism that comes along with that. Maybe they'll come up with some good ideas and try to, they do scare a lot of these big companies because they play in so many different spaces like carrier regulation and so on. Where they are used to the sharp end of the FCC. So to see them start to come on the scene and immediately get shot in one of the legs is concerning, right? Like we're sort of right back to square one in some way.
I think we're right back to square one in a lot of places, not just in cyber. But I mean, I was spending a lot of time talking to CISA at a conference I was at recently, and they were like, "We're doing our best, but we've essentially been told that Trump's going to fire all of us, even though we're non-politicals, and we don't even know if we're going to exist in a year." And
True.
that's their morale, right? So at that point, they're like, we don't even know if we're going to exist in a year.
No, I mean, CISA's had a really rough go of things. Like, we laugh and we give them a hard time and we razz them because I think there's been a lot of like high expectations. But they've had a really tough go of like the political process in so many ways, right? And they've become synonymous with the notion, like all this bullshit about government censorship of blah blah blah, and things with the Cyber League. Like there's so many ways in which CIS has just gotten sort of the short end of the stick. And to be fair, what is the point of killing yourself right now if there's a not even 50-50 chance that in a few months you're all just backs against the wall, right?
What is
So
CISA's biggest achievement? If I could ask you to identify the biggest thing CISA's achieved.
I personally would say being the one open door that industry can reach into.
A communication.
Yeah,
point.
and I think that's where their strength lies is being the open door, being out there, communicating everything. Do you think of them as a highly technical agency? Not necessarily, right? Like, I don't think that's their current strength. That's the NSA's strength, and that's fine. But the NSA's strength is not communicating with you. It is neurodiverse, and it should be, right? Like that's where it is. So CISA is the I need to have a discussion with someone and get a straight answer team, and that's perfectly good.
Yeah, but Dave, for that budget, that's what you get. I mean, like you get an open door for that budget. Like I feel like we should have a flag to stake in the ground that says CISA has done this that justifies a little bit of
I think we're going to see a lot of the things that they've done flesh out over the next 5 to 10 years, right? So that's the other thing is like I don't expect instant results, and I don't think the American people should expect instant results. I think they had a humongous mandate, constantly changing, probably bigger than they really should have had. And probably still bigger than they should have had, right? Because like the focus it's rough. But on the other hand, I think overall they've done a pretty good job. I think the whole like thread from Obama, honestly, through to Trump, and then through to the Biden team, you see a huge improvement right now in the quality of what's happening in government overall. They know who to talk to now. They signal message you, right? Like I'm pretty sure if you had something that you needed to tell the director of CISA, you could get their signal number and you could signal them. If you're at a reasonable site, that's new. Like that's super new. I don't know if like that's
yeah,
a revolution.
that is credit they deserve. And look, I'll be the first person to say that like I've been really harsh on CISA in a lot of ways, and I continue to be very harsh on CISA. And like Jen has to like at some point will hopefully forgive me for being so. But like there are aspects of what CISA has done materially that we ignore because we're a different class of people, which is to say, like threat intel producers, vendors, security space folks, like we aren't actually the main stakeholder on which you should judge CISA's accomplishments. They're busy, raising awareness for MFA and getting a bunch of these like tiny bullshit 50 people important companies in the middle of like middle America that you had no way to reach before, that you could never get them to answer anything on security. They're aware that CISA exists. They know what it means for CISA to reach out to them. That is a paradigm that has evolved that did not exist before, right? Who was supposed to go there? Secret Service?
It was always FBI.
Like, it was very...
But not being
and
FBI.
And that was hard in itself,
strength.
right? Like, absolutely, right? Like that was a self-defeating thing in and of itself. So in many ways, you created that. I think also, like, CISA's been around for a bit now, and you can talk about different CISA administrations, but like under Krebs, all the like election security stuff that happened, like there are things that have been great, even from the perspective of like raising awareness in a larger U.S. populace that had no appetite, no understanding for what was happening in cybersecurity. Cool. Is that enough? Does that match the remit? I do think that CISA
and the budget, like, guys, how much money does CISA have to spend? And I mean, like, you're telling me that this is a user awareness, and that's their biggest accomplishment is a user awareness thing and an open door. There isn't anything technically that we can plant a flag in the ground. Like, I'm just being devil's advocate here. I'm trying to get a sense of like what has CISA accomplished.
There are things that I'm sure. So let's break this apart. And again, this is where I get into trouble, right? Like, I love Chris Krebs, I love Jen Easterly. I keep getting into trouble, right? Like, I made a comment on Politico, and I'm sure Jen has not forgiven me, and nor should she.
She's not going to listen to this. Go ahead.
Fair enough. Nor should she. But look, the problem with CISA to me is, you can say they have a lot of money, and they're getting way too much money if you look at any one of these individual remits and go, what have you accomplished? I think there's a larger issue here, which is there is this undefined mission. And I think in the perspective of running a new org within the US government, the thing to do is to keep trying to expand your remit, expand your authorities, and expand your budget. And what that has done in a space as complicated and difficult and unwieldy as cyber is to create this monstrosity that has to address everything, could barely address anything, and for whom what looks like a lot of money isn't possibly nearly enough money. Like, CISA just has too many remits, too many things within it, taking authorities from other places that could have possibly done it better, could have possibly done it together, and then having to offload what are technical processes to places like the TSA that can't possibly do any of it, right? Like, that's the really weird thing about CISA. It's meant to do everything, and it kind of doesn't want to do any of it. And it's kind of been given enough money to do a lot, but it's kind of expected to do so much that it's not enough. Like, it's a very weird creature sort of in the middle of it.
Yeah, strong agree.
CISA has a big naming and shaming stick as well, though. Like, in the midst of all these Ivanti things, it's because of CISA's in the background, like cracking a whip, that you start to see companies even acknowledge little things. I mean, there's a lot of... I'm trying to give CISA a lot of credit for behind the scenes.
Although getting owned
snapping.
using
that
Ivanti thing was a bad look. So... like, that was pretty bad.
But that's the reason they had to crack the whip, right? I mean,
it's pretty embarrassing.
We're running out of time, and I want to wrap up again. It's kind of
all right. Before we do, though,
all back in once.
I want to answer.
Do not wrap up on shitting on CISA.
No, I want to answer your question from last week. Right? So
yes.
So Costin was like, "Oh my gosh, what is one?
Where are the press releases?
What's that?
Where are the press releases of these big giant success stories?"
And I was thinking about it since then.
And Dave, you actually co-wrote an article on lawfare, a responsible cyber offense, where you call for like an honor among spies or an honor among offensive security teams. When you kind of like, when you're having this conversation and Costin says, "Show me your success stories," what is your retort?
All right, I have a really clear one, and it's Kaspersky, right? Without someone popping Kaspersky.
Sorry. No, go.
Right? And I don't know who that is. Would we know how bad they've been penetrated by FSB? Right? It was pretty weird because it was just like a very unbelievable New York Times article comes out, says The Israelis hit Kaspersky, and then they discovered a bunch of FSB people sitting at the desktops, basically doing some bad stuff. Right? Now, I don't know if you can believe that article, but if it hadn't have happened, would we get the sanctions? Would we have solved a systemic issue with Russian access to both American and European like telecommunications and other hardware, right? Like this is a huge success story. The sanctions took years to develop, and you don't develop them without great information from the inside. That information could have come from a lot of places, but the only place we know it probably came from, based on Kaspersky's own reporting, is from their systems, right? We know they were an actual target. We know that they were doing bad things, and they got sanctioned for it. And we therefore protected American people, American industry, and our allies from a known threat. And I think that's a fantastic.
I feel like
story.
you've been rubbing your hands with
I
this story, and you know,
like, you want the
waiting
answer?
to come
The
on.
answer's you, man. The answer's you. That's what it is.
It's coming from inside the house. I don't think that's a good example.
I know.
I don't. I think it's a terrible example. Mostly because like it's a variety of conjectures that I don't necessarily fundamentally disagree with, but you're putting them together to tell a story that I'm not sure is the right story, right?
Big story,
I don't know.
You know, you want to talk about how we got the sanctions? Like they had enough to go on for a variety. Like moreover, what's the discussion here is like, why did you sanction individuals? And if you did, why didn't you sanction Eugene and certain individuals? Like there's so many ways in which this is like a weird one.
I mean, if you want.
Okay.
But I will say that like
please.
It's really underreported how much offensive cyber operations are used as part of sanctions enforcement. And you see this very heavily when it comes to the IRGC and oil and various Chinese tankers trying to move that oil and then getting sanctioned and people leaking how that happened, right?
True.
Like you see a lot of this information come out, and what they're saying is if you do business with these IRGC front companies, you are getting sanctioned. And that's just the way it is. We know everything.
Right.
And we know it through cyber, and we're very clear about it. And I think this has just been one of those understated things in terms of how governments operate these days, how things have changed. Kaspersky's not a counterexample, I don't think. Right? So like, is it cyber? Maybe, maybe not. But the cyber was probably a big part of that story. And that's a huge, if you think of it as removing a threat, like a dagger pointed at our necks, that's a success story to me.
Right, but that's I mean, the argument was against like the Intellexas and the Predators and the NSO groups and those guys. You're lumping them all into offensive cyber in your.
Well, you got to say, does offensive cyber solve problems first? Like, does it solve strategic problems? And it does.
Of course, it does solve problems.
And you know, in Alexa, you know, that report came out recently that they're not doing so well after they got sanctioned. I think there were.
So you're
fancy that
these.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go, Juan.
I'm saying fancy that, right? Like it's a business. You made them financially incapable of functioning. Yes, they're not going to do well.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, the question then is like, does all of the people move to another business that does the exact same thing in Cyprus? You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
You know, like these
absolutely
can be very hard.
That's a discussion we had last time, right? It's like all the cyber merc companies, if anything, you almost force them to go underground. And by underground, what we mean is they went to 3 or 4 countries that they are allowed to do whatever they want to do now, partly in service of governments that like are our frenemies, who we, you know, supposedly have good relations with, but can't possibly get to comply. So like I'm not sure the sanctions for cyber mercenary companies thing was necessarily the best way to address that.
I think that's why you're also seeing things like Pall Mall, where people are trying to build a stronger regime around how these things should work. People are trying to build norms. People are trying to sort of regularize the whole process, right? So I think they start with sanctions because that's faster than some of these other processes, but I don't think that's where we're going to end.
Dave, I saw in the tagline, the footnote of the article, criticizing Google for burning counterterrorism operations. Your name was there as kind of like an inspiration for this piece. Do you believe that Google is out of pocket, one? And how should they proceed when you find ODs attached to these offensive campaigns?
I think that,
like, what's the ask?
I don't think the ask I don't think it's a reasonable ask to say, oh, you found an ODE. Now we want to tell you what to do with it, right? That's the same. That's like the reverse of the ask that Microsoft has always said. Like, oh, you found an ODE. We want to tell you what you can do with it, right? So, and I think that's
So going to a government and asking that?
what I mean by that is I don't think it's the offensive community is telling the defensive community what to do any more than I think the defensive community should tell the offensive community what to do. But I think if you are a defensive company with broad access, you get to choose
your project
your
zero.
project,
You're
your
Googling
tag,
your project zero.
right? You get
Right.
to choose what and how you target. And I think that's probably where you want to make your choices, good or bad, right? And I think the same thing's true for offensive companies, right? They get to choose what and who they target. And what people have asked them to do is try to target stuff that affects our adversaries more than it affects us. And I think it's the exact same story on the defensive companies. Please try to target stuff that makes it so you're not protecting the Taliban.
I don't think that
This
it
is
works
such a
quite
ridiculous
that
take.
way. Yeah, it does not work quite that way. Frankly, let's start with that notion of targeting, right? Like on the defensive side, like it's not like Google. Google has an embarrassment of riches when it comes to resources in general, but I don't think they're sitting on. Look, here's 20 zero-day delivery ops boxes. Which one do we want to fuck with today? Like, I think you run into a box with 7 O-days. It's a box with 7 O-days. It's a crown jewel that you've reached. And frankly, let's discuss the counterfactual. If they ran into a box with 7 0-days, active 0-days, into platforms they control, and they looked away, like you're talking about a violation of whatever.
This is what Dave is asking. Dave is asking defensive companies to look the other way based on a notion of good and bad.
No, that's not what I said.
Who determines this?
What I said was, I don't think they run into boxes. I don't know the particulars of this particular incident.
They do inject themselves into.
That's the
these
job.
companies, yeah.
That's the job.
All right.
That is the job.
But you can pick where you decide to inject yourselves into, right? Like, are you out there protecting like bad people or good people? That's really the question, or by whatever definition you want to draw that.
You're patching O-days. Like, you're patching O-days. You're not protecting good or bad people. You're just protecting Chrome, right? Like, if you knew that Google Project Zero knew about a Chrome 0-day that's being exploited in the wild, and they said, it has a scent of America on it, and decided to leave it alone, like, A, it entails no parallel discovery, nobody else has it. B, like, they had a perfect sense of attribution, and they knew for sure it was the U.S., and we're so comfortable walking away from it. C, like, you're talking about them abandoning a core remit of what they're supposed to be doing. I think the discussion can be how you go about it, who you tell, in what order, what time you give people. All those discussions we can have. The notion that they should look at a 0-day, they are within their own house personally responsible for taking care of, and walking away from it seems.
So are you
like
trying to say they should run every O-day they find through the U.S. government?
Not necessarily, though, frankly. What is the problem? When you say run it by them, I think you and I have different definitions of that. It's one thing to walk up to whomever and say, hey, folks, I would like to make you aware that we are in the process of patching these 7 vulnerabilities in what is a very unusual circumstances for discovery.
Happens all the time.
And we will be patching these within the next 2 weeks. So if anybody would like to figure out where their equities lie, now's the time. As opposed to, like, just think of the alternative. Are they supposed to look at a Chrome 0-day and go, not today, and they just like leave it there and walk away? Like,
well, I don't know that they didn't do that in this case, right? Like, they may very well have followed that exact process.
But Dave, you can't be proposing that though. Like, that's as a norm.
That's not what I proposed at all.
Look the other way.
I think that may be the current norm.
That's what's the ask then? Tell me what's precisely the ask of
my
Stack.
ask is that where analytics can be targeted, you target them at protecting us. That's it. And where they can't be targeted, if you're just doing a broad sweep, you're doing a broad sweep. The offensive teams will manage themselves. If we get caught by a broad sweep...
Well, that's what they're doing. That's what they're doing. It got caught by a broad sweep.
Do we know exactly how they caught this particular example? Because I mean, I don't.
Yes and no. Yes and no. So let's not talk about specifics. Let's say theoretically, if you fix certain heuristics around how you, as a company, scan all these C2s around the world or these boxes around the world and figure out sort of how some of that stuff plays out, what they deliver, what they put where. If I find a box that at any point has delivered a 0-day or a strange payload or something that doesn't quite play out well in let's say a sandbox of some sort that I've designed for these weird boxes that I'm probing, and that thing pops an O-day, and when I go poke at it, it not only pops an O-day, but pops many an O-day. That is the kind of thing that you would spend quite a bit of time building other heuristics around, right? Like, you're talking about a staging box that has produced a great deal of value. Why wouldn't you spend a great deal of time building other heuristics to see what else you might find that act similarly? Not necessarily that is the same people, but like from a hunter's perspective, if you tell me that I had no detection logic that would have surfaced a box that delivers, that figures out what browser you're using, what type of device you're coming from, and then serves you with the correct O-day, then I'm messing up as a hunter, and I better spend some time figuring out how to do that. And it seems like they did. They have some very competent people. Google has plenty of logic around how it scans the internet. That is kind of like the bread and butter of what they do. And they turned that box up and a lot of other boxes. So like there is an OPSEC question here, which is just if Google has figured out a way wherein those boxes will just come to the top of an analyst pile, then the ops people need to figure some shit out. They have a larger systemic problem. And what we're doing is having a conversation about a one-off that makes us uncomfortable, but there's a broader issue here from a detection perspective.
Well, I don't know. It sounds like what you're saying is that there's detectable heuristics that you can use to find targeting boxes.
Absolutely.
Right? So makes complete sense, right? Because if you're serving two different pages depending on what browser version they're using, that's detectable.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
and I have every browser, and I have a share of most of the browsers on Earth that I can check for how they've responded to this site, for example. Not to mention my own heuristics if I wanted to run that in a sort of browser sandbox of some sort. There's people whose whole job this is, and like they do great stuff.
Okay, so let's go back to Kaspersky actually. Because I think it's a well-documented example because they gave a huge talk at CCC about what they did with triangulation, right? So,
right.
And they did quite a lot of work. I don't know if you watched the talk, but
I did.
They quite literally, they were like, we're going to reverse engineer, put all the public keys that were used in the protocol and proxy the whole thing to try to pull the whole chain back. Right?
Right.
If
what you have to do, because it's iOS and there's no way to actually inspect iOS properly. So they would have had to come up with all kinds of shit just to try to get in the middle of this thing.
Okay. If you were an American-based company or a European company, would you have also expected them to go through that much effort to peel back something that they suspected was counterterrorism?
Well, this is where you're lumping a lot of things in there. Yes, I would. If that was happening to my team in the US, I mean, I'd be infinitely proud of us, and I would love to see that level of effort. A. B. How do you say that you suspect this counterterrorism when we're finding it in our own phones? Like, okay. Unless you're saying, like, I'm staring in the mirror going, like, you're the terrorist, right? That is not a claim that I can go with you on.
Okay, let's say it's not your phones. Let's say it's a mail server somewhere in the Middle East. Right? Like, there are... All I'm trying to point out is there are scenarios here where you know enough information that you don't necessarily need to put in that kind of effort, if that makes any sense. Like, there's a space here.
You're limited. You want to throw away the fact that these people found it on their own phones, and that alone is a circumstance that, like, it's hard to not be, to discount. But also, like, yes, that's exactly the work we would do. And I say this, like, if coasting was here, like, we've done this work before for operations that could have been friendly, could have not been friendly, but the only way that you know is by doing all that work and going, look, this is the grand scope of what this thing is. And if you really sat down at the end of it and went, holy shit, everything about this looks like counterterrorism, I do think you have a much more complex discussion to have. But that's the big difference between op triangulation and whatever the hell you want to call the like Google O-Day box, right? The claim is that the Google O-Day box, whatever that operation was 1,000% counterterrorism, and someone just injected themselves in the middle of the thing. Whereas with OpTri, maybe there was some CT, but their sure shit was just plain old espionage, and your victim caught wind. And that's a situation where you don't get to be like, yo, can you guys chill out and not let people know we're spying on you, right? Like
Yeah,
I'm not
that's
saying,
ridiculous.
yeah.
That's not
So
it's just not a good comparison.
okay, I'm not trying to posit like that op triangulation was not espionage, because it looked like espionage. It acted like espionage,
Straight
right?
up.
So,
Yeah.
and obviously, I think the name is a little silly as well.
Yeah.
There was, and we could probably talk about that for a bit too. I think that in this particular case, when you're looking at counterterrorism ops, I think there's also a requirement on governments that they separate out counterterrorism ops from espionage ops when it comes to their whole tool chain, which is something that people don't talk about. But I think we did list.
This is the responsible part of the responsible offense that you're arguing
Correct.
for.
I think that was in the paper that we published on Lawfare, which I think is an important part of it, but is difficult to ask some of your smaller governments, right? So like if you talk to the United States, that's certainly a possibility. If you talk to, a tiny little government somewhere, it's harder for them to say, oh yeah, we have two completely different tool chains, one which you use for counterterrorism and one which we use for, espionage and other things, or law enforcement. Like law enforcement should be separate as well, right? So I think these are complicated questions. That's why it's an evolving surface.
I want to just to close the loop on the Google thing is the notion that if Google actually builds capabilities for government spying, we would all frown on it. But we're asking them to turn a blind eye to their obligation to fix it, and that doesn't compute in my brain.
No,
And they ask of Google
because
from
I think it's at the wrong spot in the chain, right? Like once you found something, then at that point you have to follow your processes. I think the places where you make decisions are higher up. They come into budgeting and targeting, and that's the same stuff you would ask of an offensive company.
I think this is where the Vuln folks, and I'm sort of putting you as a representative on that side, like are not as familiar with the hunting process where you would abstract some form of a heuristic from this, and I will bet you're going to find multiple boxes from different types of actors all together. So that's what motivates the process to iterate on this. You go, hey, there was a blind spot that didn't catch this immediately. If we fix that, what else do we find? And it won't just be boxes from some Western gov. You're also going to run into some random other threat actor that uses a similar JavaScript logic to find this, that, and the other. So like that is precisely what hunters are supposed to do.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think it's very interesting that there's an equal blindness from the offensive teams when it comes to how defensive heuristics work as there is from the defensive teams when it comes to how offensive teams work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can we leave it there and pick it up another time?
Sure.
We were an hour and 5 minutes
Winning.
in. Dave Aitel, you were amazing. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Juan,
Brother.
fantastic. Thanks. Congratulations on your Black Hat Talk being accepted. We'll get into it next week. And Dave, just quickly, what are you up to with Cordyceps Systems? I know you left Immunity and you launched this new company. Are you guys what specific areas are you guys?
Honestly, we do national security work and a lot of graph databases. And these days we're competing with the DARPA AI Cyber Challenge. So we're trying to find
What
bugs
are you building?
with LLMs. And it's going, I'll say, middling. It's sometimes you're good, sometimes you're bad. But there's no other way to do it than to do it.
Sounds great. Come back when you guys win the challenge and we'll have a long conversation about it. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.